Welcome to the All Outdoors Photography Podcast. This podcast is about all things outdoor photography, including landscapes, wildlife, macro, and more. The show features two talented photographers, Henry Doyle and Ryan Taylor, who bring their different experiences in photography to the podcast. The show is released weekly every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so I hope you sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. In today's episode, Henry and Ryan feature Stephen Neff on the show, a national sales manager with Venus Optics. Henry and Ryan were given two Laowa lenses to try out, and we'll talk about their photographic experiences with them. And Stephen will talk about using macro and wide-angle lenses from Laowa.
Welcome back to episode 64 of the All Outdoors Photography Podcast. And today we're having a salesman from a pretty popular lens company.
Yes, we have Stephen Neff on the show. Welcome, Stephen. Go ahead and tell us about where you work and your photography background.
Henry, Ryan, thank you guys for having me on the All Outdoors Photography Podcast. I'm definitely excited to be here, and I wanted to give a shout out to Hunts for introducing us. Hunts Photo camera store in New England, a couple locations. So quick background on Laowa. Venus Optics is the company. Laowa is a brand of lenses. Relatively young lens manufacturer, established in 2013. So still less than 10 years old at this point. I have had a relationship with the company for about 5 years, and last year I took over as the national sales manager here in the U.S. Two different directions. So the background on me is camera stores. I started about 20 years ago here in Buffalo, New York, working for Delaware Camera, a small family-owned camera store that is still in business today. And that was my first job right out of high school. When I was in fourth grade, people would ask, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I didn't have an answer, but I had a camera at that point, and so I started to answer with I want to be a photographer. And it developed from there, and started working, assisted on my first weddings at 16, shooting events, shooting with the local sports photographer. I got to shoot the Buffalo Sabres, and I got to shoot a bunch of other pro sports, arena football, a lot of fun stuff. And as I was shooting, I was starting to realize that I love photography. I don't necessarily like being a photographer. It is a lot of work. It is the creative aspects and the push and drive there is stuff that I didn't quite have. I looked and saw other photographers. For example, so my sister does not have a photo background, doesn't have a technical understanding. If I hand her my camera, she can pick it up and take some amazing, beautiful pictures because she has an eye, right? The composition component of photography is so important and so critical. And my approach to photography is much more of a technical. I'm a technical photographer, and so the practice for me is composition, is creating a compelling image, not necessarily a technically complex. Because I'll sit there and dial in from a technical standpoint, trying to get an image just perfect, but the composition is so much more important. So first job out of high school I'd been working. I had been recommended by somebody to talk to the camera store, which I think is a great path for people that are interested in photography but aren't quite sure how to make it a full-time thing or how to make it into a career. Starting working at a camera store, you are exposed to all different kinds of photography, all different kinds of equipment, and building a network and building relationships with other photographers, which certainly is a very valuable asset to have. So I worked on and off for the camera store for about 10 or 11 years. Went back to college a couple times in there. And yeah, worked a whole bunch of different roles and different things. And then eventually I went back to school. I went to Syracuse University and studied business. I got my MBA in 2013. Looking for jobs, the owner of the camera store said that I should talk to the Photographic Research Organization, which is a co-op of about 120 camera stores around the US, a handful in Canada, and at this point they've got dealers in Australia, Costa Rica, and I believe England now as well. So it's a co-op. So the company is owned by all of the different camera stores, and they function in a bunch of different ways to help support those camera stores with marketing tools and distribution, as well as some other exclusive camera accessory brands. Yeah, so I worked for Pro for about 5.5 years. I was a product manager on the Laowa account. Laowa was distributed through Pro, and so that sort of led me to where I am at this point, working directly for Laowa as the national sales manager. So that's a little clip of my background. Photography has always been a thread throughout my career and throughout what I do. I still don't consider myself a photographer, which I get some flack from people because I am taking pictures all the time. I have more cameras than probably more cameras than most people that consider themselves photographers and lenses and equipment. So I still don't consider myself a photographer because that's still aspirational to me, I guess. Being able to support myself or to be able to have a career around my photographs and be creating images that are compelling enough to support a career, that I've recognized is not my goal, not my skill set. I enjoy photography. I enjoy shooting. For a long time, I've said that the photography is for me. But now I'm starting to realize that it becomes a teaching and training tool. I enjoy learning about the different pieces of equipment and learning about photography to be able to help other people shoot better and to be able to help other people understand different pieces of gear. And so that's where Laowa is such a great fit for me and for my approach to photography. I have spent the last year that I've been the national sales manager constantly picking up a different camera, a different lens, trying to take pictures in different ways so that I can learn and understand the different pieces of equipment so that I can help better explain it and help better show it to other photographers and show them how they can use these tools in their creative pursuits. I think that gives enough of like my background. At this point, my primary subject, I've got a 5-year-old daughter who is beautiful, and slowly but surely I am training her to be a good muse and a good portrait subject. Right. It's I always so one of my favorite photographers, a very close friend, who's a wedding photographer here in Buffalo, New York, Jeff Barnes, Jeffrey T. Barnes Photography. I worked with him at the camera store when I was just starting out, and I've said I knew who my wedding photographer was going to be before I knew who the bride was going to be.
Wow.
Just his work is beautiful, and he just has such a great approach to it. And so he has 5 children, and having watched his children grow up, they're all, I believe, in their 20s at this point. Yeah, they must all be in their 20s at this point if I've been doing this for 20 years. Um, they were his subjects, and he was able to shoot a lot of amazing pictures just because, right, Dad, you've got the camera. Okay, yep, we're doing this. Fine. And like, all right, yes, we're taking pictures. And so having kids, one, it's you have kids so that you have somebody to mow the lawn, but also as a photo subject, as a model.
Yes.
So yeah, so most of my photography at this point certainly has been of her and family growing up stuff. But to shift into the Laowa conversation, so we said Laowa is about 9 years old at this point, not quite, and the question, the two-part question. One, my background. So that's a big, long background of how I got to where I am here. The Laowa background, looping back on that, is young company. They started. Mr. Lee is the founder of the company. He is a lens designer. He's the chief lens designer for Laowa. He has been designing lenses for other companies, other lens manufacturers across a wide range of the industry. He's got 40 different patents globally for different optical designs for different things, and so he had come up with a couple of different lens designs that none of the manufacturers were really interested in producing. Specifically, one of the lens designs was a 60 millimeter f2.8 2:1 macro.
Oh.
Right, so it's not like we think of macro lenses as macro is defined as 1:1. So the size of your subject is the same size as the image that's being projected onto your sensor. That's what we think of as 1:1. That's true macro. Why stop there was the question he asked, right? Why not go to a 2x? And so he had this lens design that would go to a 2x, and worked with a few different people to form the company. He's originally from Hefei in central China. He'd been living in Japan at that time, and still lives in Japan, but was able to found the company in his hometown in central China. So the 60 millimeter lens was the start of things, and then made a 15 millimeter macro lens, so an ultra wide lens, full frame coverage, that will do a 1:1 macro. So it doesn't go all the way down into that 2:1, but it's an ultra wide field of view. So 15 millimeter that still lets you focus down to a 1:1 magnification.
So real quick, Stephen, about kind of the 1:1, like what kind of look does that provide? Like for some of our maybe like non-macro photographers in the audience, like what kind of look does 1:1 provide, or even further than that?
It's close up, right? It is.
Mm-hmm.
Think about, right, if you're looking at something and you get really close to it just with your eye, right? You're looking right on top of something, and so then you can then magnify and blow up the image. So if I've got the example that I use is a penny, right? So if I take a picture of a penny, it's going to just about fill the sensor on my camera, right, from top to bottom. A penny is 18. I think, no. What's the measurement of a penny? I think it's 18 millimeters.
Yeah,
and then the size of the sensor on a full frame camera is 24 by 36 millimeters. So if you were to take a picture of a penny at a 1:1 magnification, the penny is going to be roughly fill the frame from top to bottom. You're going to have a couple millimeters on the top or on the bottom, but then you can take that picture and blow it up to whatever size you normally would, right? If I'm making an 8x10, I'm blowing a penny up and I'm making a print of it as an 8x10, and it's filling the frame almost. So that's at a 1-to-1. When I go down to a 2-to-1 magnification, I'm magnifying in and getting even closer, and now I'm on the same. We're looking at a penny here. I think we'll actually throw some slides up. Some slides up to show an image of a penny shot at a 2-to-1 magnification to see, because not only does the penny fill the frame vertically, but the penny actually fills the frame from side to side at a 2-to-1 magnification. Right, so 36 millimeter. Right, if we think of a 36 millimeter is the horizontal measurement of your full frame sensor, 35 millimeter sensor. 18 millimeters is the diameter of the penny. If we shoot it at a 2-to-1 magnification, the penny ends up filling the frame from side to side, and you end up cropping off the top and the bottom of the penny. So we're talking about close up. We're talking about being right on top of your subject, or filling the frame with a subject, being right, very, very, very close, taking pictures of small subjects and still having the camera focus in on them.
Wow. That's awesome. You enlightened me there. I had no idea that the 1-to-1 was like more in relation to your sensor rather than the lens. So thanks for that knowledge.
So it's not in relation to the sensor, right? So if we're shooting with a micro four thirds camera, and we're shooting with at a 1-to-1 magnification, the penny is going to more than fill the frame, right? Because the size of the penny in real life never changes. So that 1-to-1, that's the ratio of the size of the penny in real life to the size of the penny in projected onto the sensor.
Okay.
So if we're using a smaller sensor, we're just cropping in down on the penny. So if we take a picture of a penny in a micro four thirds sensor, we're just cropping down in on it a little bit closer and a little bit tighter. So for macro photography, there are a lot of photographers out there that will use APS-C cameras or micro four thirds cameras, because you're getting the image ends up filling more of the frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more pixels on the subject, essentially.
Yeah, right, because we're just cropping down, but the 1-to-1 ratio stays the same. So you're just cropping down in tighter on the subject. So I think we got there, and looping back into the continuation. So the Laowa has started making, at this point, we've got the 60 millimeter 2-to-1 macro, the 15 millimeter 1-to-1 macro. And so why start with macro? So all of the Laowa lenses are manual focus. Everything we make at this point is a manual focus lens. When you're shooting macro, most of the time you're going to switch the camera into manual focus anyways, right? When you're dealing with those really close subject distances, there's a couple of things happen, and a couple of things change. Nothing changes, but there are some challenges that come together, and physics starts to become a challenge. Right, when we think of depth of field, we have 3 different things in photography that will affect depth of field. The first one, right, is the one that we learn first, and one of the when you first learn aperture and understanding of its control over depth of field, I think that is a very enlightening point for people in their photography, is when you first start to understand, oh, okay, I have this control over how much light is getting into the camera that also controls how much of the image is in focus, right? So that's our first control over first thing that controls depth of field is the aperture, the lens opening. But also what controls depth of field or affects depth of field is the focal length of our lens, right? So a longer focal length lens will have a shallower depth of field. And also, the distance to the subject affects our depth of field. So when we get to a smaller and smaller distance away from the subject, the depth of field gets shallower and shallower. And so when we're dealing with shooting in these, shooting at 1-to-1 or going beyond it, the depth of field we're talking about millimeters, and on some of the lenses we're talking a depth of field that is less than a millimeter. So like just sort of a thin slice, a thin plane going through the image that's actually sharp and in focus. So yeah, they're trying to use an autofocus system to get that focus point exactly where you want it. Autofocus, and certainly mirrorless autofocus, has improved significantly. I think that's one of the areas. The megapixel race ended years ago. The high ISO low light sensitivity race is still on, but I think we're getting to a little bit of a point of diminishing returns. At this point, I think what autofocus is one of the areas that has seen some of the most improvements in the last 5 years. And looking at the newest tier, the newest round of mirrorless cameras from pretty much all of the manufacturers, it's really cool to see what they're all doing. And the focus tracking and subject lock and all these different things. I have yet to see any of them that even attempt to specialize into autofocus for macro photography.
Yeah.
The depth of field is so shallow, and the distances, right? The from a composition standpoint and a movement standpoint, trying to get the camera to pick out exactly what you want to be in focus and keep it there becomes a challenge. And even if you have autofocus, most of the time you end up switching into manual focus.
I've definitely found that in my own experience. Like I have the R5, and before I tried this macro lens, I would use my 1-to-500, and I would always have to switch to manual because the focus points just aren't small enough even to get that perfect depth of field like you were talking about. So
and the autofocus system on the R5, like there are arguments to be made that it is one of the best autofocus systems ever made.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's amazing in most areas.
Yeah, but it's still macro. Yeah, it doesn't change any of the physics about photography. It just magnifies them.
Yeah.
So that's why Laowa has started specializing. One of the areas is macro lenses, right? And so those first two lenses, macro, because autofocus is not important. The other area that Laowa specializes in and has made some really interesting creative lenses is wide angle, right? So ultra wide angle, that was the third lens that we made, was the 12 millimeter f2.8 rectilinear ultra wide lens, and that lens is the first to get the moniker that Laowa uses of 0D or zero distortion, right? So it's a rectilinear lens. It's not a fisheye. It's not spherical bending the corners, but you're getting an ultra wide 12 millimeter crazy field of view with a full frame coverage. And so that in its time and even still is one of the widest lenses that has a full frame coverage. Still manual focus. Okay, well, it's not macro, but we said that the focal length of your lens also affects depth of field. A wider focal length lens has a larger depth of field, so it's much easier to manually focus and get your subject in focus. It's much more likely that the subject is going to fall within that depth of field. One of the The one of our newer lenses, we've got a 9mm full frame. It's an f5.6 full frame mirrorless lens. Rectilinear, it's 135-degree field of view, so crazy wide to still be rectilinear, right? It's not a fisheye. It doesn't bubble out and bend the corners around. That lens, it's hard to miss the focus. I've done it. I have that special skill. You can certainly do it. You can certainly miss the focus, but because you have such a large depth of field, because it's such a wide-angle lens, it's generally easier to get the focus into position. The other change that's happened in the last 5 years that's really helped is I will make the argument and stand by. It is easier to manually focus a lens on a modern mirrorless camera than it ever has been to manually focus a lens on any system at any point in history, right? A split prism or rangefinder focusing, or using a loop on the back of a view camera with a sheet over your head. Like, using a modern mirrorless camera, we've got tools like focus peaking, where the camera is using an algorithm going through and finding the highest points of contrast, right? And when you have a high point of contrast, that means generally you're going to have a sharp line. If you've got a sharp line, that means that area of the image is in focus. And so we've got focus peaking tools that show us and highlight the areas of the image that are in focus. We also have the ability to magnify and zoom down in on an image, right? Looking through like a DSLR or looking through a viewfinder, you can't magnify it in, right? You can't zoom in on any specific area and see, all right, is the critical focus right on this point? If I'm taking a picture of a flower, I need to know that critical focus is right on the stamen, right on the little piece coming right out the middle. Like, I want that critical focus right where it needs to be. And with a mirrorless camera, yeah, I can punch down in, I can zoom right into the center of the frame, I can see or move around wherever in the frame I need it to be, and fine tune and make sure that that's where my focus is. So, yeah, using a modern mirrorless camera for manual focus lenses, it's pretty easy. I mean, it's still manual focus. But if you've ever used a K1000 or an old 35mm SLR that still gives you a decent focus system, this is much easier than that, right? It's much easier to use a mirrorless camera than it has with any other system. So,
yeah, and focus peaking too as well.
Yeah, focus peaking, and then I've only been able to play with it really quick on the R5. They have a couple of the different simulated manual focus modes. So they have the simulated split prism manual focus.
I've never seen that, but
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's on the R5 and the R6 where you can switch the manual focus assist over to where it will give you like a simulated split prism view. And so you have to align the image to focus it. So there's a bunch of cool things out there that are happening. I am a mirrorless evangelist. I think, certainly the last 2 generations of mirrorless cameras are finally at a point, and the manufacturers have stopped making DSLRs for the most part, because for most use cases, mirrorless cameras are going to have an advantage over DSLR. That was not the use case. I switched over to a mirrorless camera about 7 years ago. I switched to a Fuji system. I love Fuji. That is still the system that I consider my own. That's my camera is the Fuji. But I have a Nikon Z. I have a couple of Micro Four Thirds cameras. I've got a Canon 5D Mark III, and Yeah, and I've gone through a couple different Sony cameras. I'm not sure which one I'm gonna stick with at this point, but trying to keep all the systems. Yeah, the Fuji. There was when I got in with Fuji, my first camera was the XT1 and then an XT10. Um, there were still some compromises compared to shooting with a DSLR.
Hmm.
Um, and in the last certainly in the last this most recent generation um, of mirrorless cameras, uh, yeah, it's hard to continue to make an argument that like a DSLR has an advantage. And I think the autofocus was a big factor there, and viewfinder lag. Um, the first time I picked up a Nikon Z6, right after launch, it was 6 or 7 years ago, looking through the viewfinder, it was, oh, okay, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what it needs to be. Where it felt almost like picking up my F100 and looking through the viewfinder, right? Big, large image, large projection, fast, bright, and super, super sharp, really high resolution screen. And so that changes those little user interface things. Certainly can change the experience quite a bit, to the point where, yeah, I don't, certainly when I'm shooting macro, I don't like shooting with the DSLR. The 5D Mark III is an amazing camera. I'm happy to pull out the telephoto lens for some sports stuff with it, but for macro shooting at this point, being able to have a flipping screen, like a flip out screen, so that you're not right, because the with macro you're getting the camera into all different weird angles. You don't want to always have to be able to twist your body around and try and get to a point where you can see through the viewfinder to check your focus. Um, Being able to flip the screen out, double check it, zoom right down in on where you want it focused, and click. It's yeah. As I say, I am a mirrorless evangelist, and I could certainly go on about the advantages of mirrorless systems. Yeah, at this point, and I understand it's not quite as bad as the early film to digital transition, where you've got a lot of holdouts that will stick with film and say, film is still superior, or what, in whatever fashion. There's still a place for film. It's something different, but for the bulk of photography, um, just like transitioning from film to digital makes sense, transitioning from a DSLR systems over to mirrorless systems, there are enough advantages at this point that it really makes sense to make that transition.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so continuing on the Laowa story, so the macro has been one area that we've really pushed and grown. Wide angle, so we've got the 12 millimeter, and then subsequently we've got a bunch of other really cool ultra wide angle lenses. The a 15 millimeter f2, that's a mirrorless lens that also gets the 0D moniker. We've got a couple of 14 millimeter f4, super compact, really nice quality ultra wide lenses. We've got a couple of those for both DSLR shooters or mirrorless shooters. And the one of the things that Laowa has been able to do with their mirrorless lens lineup is designing lenses specifically for mirrorless systems, right? So taking into account the shorter flange distance, and making lenses that are more compact and much smaller to complement the mirrorless systems. Yeah, so we've got a set of the ultra wide lenses that are all designed specifically for mirrorless. We don't have versions of them that will go on a DSLR camera. And because everything is manual and mechanical, we don't have to we don't have to retrofit or try and figure out working with the camera's electronic systems. We're just making a lens that will mount onto the camera and just using the optics of that lens, not using any of the electronics or electronic interface. So we're able to make lenses for the Nikon Z system, or for the Canon RF system, or for the Panasonic Leica L system. We have lenses for all of the different camera systems, just because we can make the lens design, and it's just a matter of changing the lens mount. We don't have to get the electronics inside the lens to work with the camera, because generally there are no electronics inside the lens. It's just metal and glass and little plastic rings to hold things together, shims and stuff. But yeah, talking, not being able to, you guys have each been able to play with a couple of Laowa lenses. One of the things that I say and ask is, have you ever used like a nice older manual focus lens?
I have not since probably film class in high school. Something that's quite similar on that level.
Okay. So like,
yeah, I really haven't. Besides, I've got like a Canon FD 50mm, but I don't even know if that's considered nice. It's just a old film lens. But
the FD, yeah, I would still consider. I mean, that's going to be, a basic design, but a good quality. It's got a reasonably dampened focus ring, a good solid construction, right? It's, again, metal and glass. So that's a lot of the feel of Laowa, right? It's a classic feel, well dampened, manual focusing rings. But then it's also new, right? It's new in the sense that we're using new lens designs, new materials, new manufacturing techniques to make lenses for new and modern cameras, right? We're making lenses specifically to take advantage of these new modern mirrorless systems. And it's not like there's definitely a community of people out there that really enjoy going out and hunting down specific older film lenses that have a special look or have a special feature or advantage to them. And so, yeah, you've got collectors or photographers that will specifically go out and try and find an older lens. This can give you a lot of those different, a lot of the different unique feels and stuff without having to dig through an old pawn shop to see if they have the Super Takumar 51.4 that you've been looking for, or any of those out there, the lenses that hold a certain mystique to them. There's a bunch of the Laowa lenses that can fill those, can sort of fill those areas without having to deal with an old lens that may have dust or mechanical issues in the gearing or fungus in the lenses. It's a new lens. You don't have to deal with the stuff of when you're using a lens from the 1970s, which I personally have a handful of lenses that I do go back to and use that they each have their own special look, and challenges as well. And so the Laowa has continued to push and build new things, right? Different lens designs. Laowa is not making, it's just another 50mm, right? It's pretty much every Laowa lens offers something new and different that hasn't been available on the market before, right? So that starting right with that 60mm 2:1 macro. Yes, there are other 60mm macro lenses out there, but this one goes beyond. This one allows you to focus closer than anything else that's on the market. Are the 9mm f5.6 rectilinear lens. That is the widest rectilinear full frame 35mm coverage lens on the market. We've got a couple other areas. So one of the lenses that we are most famous for is going to be the 24 millimeter probe lens. And I'm sure you guys have seen
Yeah.
some of the footage that comes out of that lens.
Oh yeah, it's crazy. That's an awesome lens.
Yeah. So I am the first to say, and I enjoy saying, it's not an easy lens to use, right? It's big. It's about 16 inches long. It's a little bit of an awkward shape with the coming to a tapered point. So it's a 24 millimeter. F14 to F40 is the aperture range. It is a light hungry lens, right? You need a lot of light for that lens. So it's not easy. It's not it's a challenging lens to use, but the images and what you're able to get out of it, there's nothing else out there that can do it, right? There are no other lenses really that can do what that lens can do. When you get into some of the cinema areas, there are other probe lenses. They're certainly more expensive and more limiting on their capabilities. So, that Laowa probe lens has opened up a lot of different areas. And when Mr. Lee was first developing, when Laowa first coming out with that lens, the scope of what it would be used for, from Laowa's perspective, was still relatively narrow. It's a niche. All right, it's a niche ultra macro 2:1, but a 24 millimeter wide angle, so you can get a little bit of a bug eye kind of view. You can get right down with a subject and still see some of the perspective. You still have some image in the background as well, along with your macro subject in the foreground. So you get that wide field of view while having that close up. Since the launch, and even right after the launch, the number of different applications for that lens has just exploded, and the different, like, what people are able to do. Certainly B-roll, and that lens really loves video, loves cinema and movement. So if you're recording a video clip or B-roll for a commercial or something, getting a 24 millimeter lens and gliding along a subject, or moving along a subject, or moving through a space with it, the parallax distortion as you're moving along a subject, it's really, really compelling and really interesting. I've said, if you've seen a potato chip commercial in the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen work done by that Laowa probe lens. And a lot of product photography and product videography. One of the most recent Apple product launches, there are a bunch of different clips of the product where it's either shot with the Laowa probe, or it's all CGI, and they're just they've got a mock-up of the product with a really high resolution, which I'm sure they have, a true resolution mock-up, CGI mock-up of all the different products. But that look, it's something that you can't get with anything else. And so expanding the capabilities, expanding the creative options of what's out there and available.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. Henry and I actually use quite a bit our lenses for video, and maybe you could touch upon that too with Laowa lenses.
Yeah. So the two main areas we talked about, so macro and wide angle. One of the other areas that Laowa has built out and worked on is the cinema line, right? So we have most of the cinema line are photo lenses that have been rehoused into a cinema-friendly housing, right? So the apertures have been declicked, and the focus ring and aperture rings are geared so that you can use a follow focus system, and you can gear the lenses to work on a cinema rig. And most most cinema lenses, you're going to be shooting manual focus. So that, again, that's not a hindrance on Laowa being manual focus. And yeah, so lenses like that 12 millimeter ultra wide angle with a full frame coverage, that's a rectilinear. That becomes a lens that a lot of cinematographers want to have available, because there really isn't anything else out there in that range that can do what it can do. So, right, you get down into 15 millimeter ultra wides, but having that little bit of extra field of view, that 10 or 15% extra, can make a difference in a shot. And so it has some really compelling images as well. We also have a handful of lenses that are cinema exclusive, right? So the biggest and the marquee is going to be, we have we call it the lens. It's OOOM. It stands for Out of Our Minds. So that is it's a 25 to 100 millimeter parafocal cinema lens, super 35 coverage, which is roughly equivalent to an APS-C size sensor, is the coverage on that. And that really pushes having a cinema zoom that is parafocal. So as you are the focus breathing, so minimized focus breathing, and it is designed that parafocal, as you're adjusting the zoom, the focus point does not shift, right? So you can zoom, like you can have a shot where you zoom into a subject, and as long like the focus point doesn't change from the wide angle to the telephoto point. And so that the lens is really, really cool. It's a PL mount, native, but then we do have adapters for you can switch it over to a Sony E or a Canon EF mount, and then we also have an anamorphic adapter for that lens and a full frame expander. If you want to put it on a full frame camera, there's an additional optic that you can put onto swap onto the back that will magnify the lens even more. It ends up being adjusting the focal length of the lens a little bit. But yeah, that is our first true cinema lens. And then just this week, we've launched a couple of other cinema lenses that don't have photo versions available. We've got a Micro Four Thirds 6 millimeter ultra wide angle lens, right? So, and that's also got the 0D. So that's a Micro Four Thirds equivalent of that 12 millimeter 0D. Certainly a different optical design and performs differently, but the 6 millimeter with a 2x crop factor gives you roughly that 12 millimeter field of view. And so that one's really cool. We've got we've got a 7.5 millimeter super 35 coverage lens. So again, ultra wide angle. And so the cinema line, we've got a couple of other fun things coming later this year. So certainly exciting on that front.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Henry and I met up in the field last December, and we used the 14 millimeter f4, and it was great for the video mode. So we made a couple of videos out of that too. Yeah, Henry, what was your experience using the macro lens?
Yeah, I thought it was great. I thought it was a great build quality. Like it felt very high quality, but it was also super lightweight, which is really nice because it's kind of a long lens, and I didn't expect it to be that light. But it's nice to just put it in the bag, and if I come across a macro subject, it's it's not a problem to have along with me. So it's been great on that front. Nice and sharp, like really great. Like no difference between any kind of Canon L series or anything. Like just super sharp, super high quality. The minimum focus distance, is it a 1-to-1? The RF macro, is that?
The RF macro will go all the way to 2:1.
Okay.
You have the 100mm 2.8
Yeah.
RF. That one will go all the way to a 2:1 magnification.
Yeah, so I've in the past I've tried I think I've tried a 1-to-1 in the past, and this is my first 2-to-1, and it's just like another world. It's crazy. Just yesterday I was down in a park and I was shooting these early daffodils. I could just get basically in the daffodil. That's how close I could get. It was just insane. And that magnification just makes it larger than life for sure. So it's been great. I really like it. Aperture ring, manual focus ring, all that kind of stuff. It's great as well. I use autofocus a lot, but it's nice to slow down with that. And I think for macro anyway, that's what I ended up doing. So like you were saying.
Yeah, and the 100mm there, and there's 2 points I'll make on that lens specifically. So one, the 100mm, it's about a $500 lens. So when you compare it to compare it to so last year Canon launched their RF 100mm 2.8. So it's autofocus, it's image stabilized. One of the marquee features that they have on that is it will go to a 1.4:1 magnification. So still doesn't make it to a 2:1, but it does go beyond a 1:1. That's a $1,400 lens. And so, all right, the image stabilization and the autofocus are going to be two of the biggest advantages over the Laowa. But for macro, and certainly as we're approaching 1:1 and going beyond it, your autofocus you're going to turn off. You're going to end up using manual focus. And the image stabilization, there's a little bit of an advantage with image stabilization, but at those macro distances, the image stabilization struggles to really help stabilize very much. You're not getting your full 4 or 5 stops of stabilization out of it. And more now you've got in-body image stabilization, right? So that is able to is able to help stabilize the image, so you don't need it built into the lens. And it's a pretty significant price difference there.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the other, from a size standpoint, just in the last couple months, we've launched a brand new 85mm 2:1 macro. So it's an 85mm f5.6 mirrorless native design. So it's designed specifically for the mirrorless system. So Nikon Z, Canon R, Sony E, and the Panasonic L. I think we have a Leica M mount of that lens as well. That's one of the few. We've got a handful of lenses that also come in an M mount, which is cool. So the 85mm, when you're going to an f5.6, we're able to shrink the lens down significantly. So that lens ends up being really, really compact. And so the compromise, all right, it's not a 2.8. We're losing 2 stops of light. But again, for macro and certainly getting into these ultra macro ranges, the depth of field is so shallow that you're not going to be shooting at 2.8. You're going to be shooting down at f5.6 or f11. Right? You're going to be closing the aperture down because you need that extra depth of field for your composition most of the time. So that 50 or the 85mm f5.6, if you've got a new mirrorless system, or you've been shooting mirrorless for a little while and are interested in macro in any way, that is the lens that I point people towards at this point. It's just super, super compact. And as you said, right, it's something that's easy, like throwing in the bag, right? The 100mm, it's light, but it's still a commitment, right? If you're going to go out for a hike and maybe you're going to shoot some landscape is your goal, just throwing the macros, throwing that 100mm in your bag, or any 100mm, not just the Laowa, but any of the manufacturers' 100mm, like, it's a commitment. It's a bigger lens. It's going to take up space in a bag, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's light for its size, but it's not light. I wouldn't say, and none of them are
Hmm.
light. But the 85 millimeter is, right. It's really easy to say, all right, I'm going to throw this lens in my bag, and maybe I'll end up shooting some macro.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, for me too, like I'm mostly a wildlife guy, so I'm used to, 4 or 5 pound lenses. So for me, like anything under that size is just like almost nothing. So,
Yeah, all
uh,
right. It's all a matter of perspective
for
there
sure.
then.
Yeah.
If you're walking around with, and you said the 100 500, so
Uh huh.
I should have known.
No, you're all good. Yeah. Um, I know what you mean though. It's not like the smallest lens in the world, but for me, it's like the perfect size. So,
Yeah.
uh huh.
I I would push you to take a look at that 85 millimeter.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's been my new favorite, and it's sort of lived on my Z6 for the last couple weeks for
Cool.
sure.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so then the 14 millimeter that you guys had as well. So good for video. It's a good, like, it's yeah, it was launched last year. It's a DSLR specific design. It doesn't have any mirrorless mounts. It's specifically for EF or Nikon F. And I really look at it as one, like as a good staple all around ultra wide. If you're continuing to shoot in a DSLR system, it's like, yeah, if you have a setup and you're looking for something that'll go wide, um, yeah, it's just a really great little lens, um, and it has some creature comforts as well. There's a really cool focus locking system to adjust the infinity focus. So for astrophotography, if you're out shooting and you want to, right, you need to get infinity's focus locked in and targeted specifically. Most lenses, if you adjust the focus all the way to the end, you're going to focus past infinity, which is good. You want that. You don't want a lens um, that is going to restrict you and stop you right at infinity, because temperature swings and differences and changes, that slight difference, you may, like, if something shifts, you may get to a point where when you dial the lens all the way over to infinity, it doesn't actually focus at infinity. And so you're limited there. So most lenses allow you to go past to accommodate for slight variations and slight changes. But that 14 millimeter f4, it has a tool that allows you to loosen the focus ring, dial in infinity. So during daylight hours, or when you're in a situation where you've got a good subject out at infinity that you can focus in on and lock on, um, and then adjust the focus ring over to the endpoint where it is infinity, lock it down, and then when you're out shooting for the astro work, you can just dial the lens all the way over to and lock it on the end, and you know that you're going to be locked at infinity focus. So a couple cool, relatively unique features on a lens like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I didn't get to use it for astro or nighttime photography, but that's definitely something I'll keep in mind. But yeah, I really enjoyed the lens. It's solidly constructed. I'm so used to autofocus that the manual focus is a little bit something to get used to, but I adjusted pretty well after using it for out in the field a little while. And that distortion is like non-existent, which is awesome too, with the wide angle, of course.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to play around with, and like I often find myself when I'm shooting with those wide angles just sort of panning back and forth, and watching that parallax shift, watching the everything sort of spread as it gets closer to the edge of the image. Um, yeah, I really enjoy wide angle. Um, I've been an ultra wide shooter for a long time. Um, and macro in the last year, I've had to learn a lot, and I'll make the argument that macro may be one of the hardest disciplines to
Hmm.
perfect.
Yeah.
It's
Agreed.
definitely easy to get into, but the technical,
To do it well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to do it really, not even to do it well. You could do it well, um, yeah, fairly simply. It certainly takes some work to get there. Um, but it's a deep, deep hole, and you can keep like fine tuning and adjusting and getting into some of the ultra macro stuff and going. So we also have a 25 millimeter 2.5 to 5x macro lens. Um, right. So we're not stopping at a 2-to-1 now. We're starting at a 2.5x macro and going all the way down into a 5x. Um, so that's where you're like at 2x you start to see things that you didn't notice before. Right? You start to see things about an object that when you're just looking at it in real life, you might not notice. Um, yeah, when you get down to a 5x, you start approaching uh, microscope magnification territory, right? Most microscopes are going to start in that 10x, 6 to 10x range. And so 5x with a full frame sensor coverage is pretty impressive, and you can do some really cool stuff with it. And yeah, talking about seeing the world, seeing a different world, seeing things that you don't notice. Yeah, at 5x, everything is different and everything changes. And the slightest change in position can change the composition significantly. So I've been playing with that lens the past couple months. The challenge to myself with that has been um, snowflake photography. I'm still trying. I've got a couple. I have one that I'm okay with. One shot that I've taken, but yeah, I'm up in Buffalo, New York, so I figure I've got another month. Uh, in through April, I've got another month. I'll get a couple more shots at perfecting my snowflakes. But that's that ultra macro range where you start getting down into stuff that um, really razor thin depth of field, and you start getting into using tools like focus stacking and some other areas there, which very, very powerful. You can do a lot of different things, and like focus stacking. I don't know if either of you have tried it out, or if any of the listeners, just do it. Just spend dedicate an hour to finding a subject, taking a whole stack of images and running it through the software.
Mm-hmm.
Photoshop itself will do a decent photo stack. It's yeah, not necessarily the best software, but I would just so you start thinking about photography, like it opens up a different way to think about photography, and certainly a different way to think about macro photography. Um, it's very easy to shoot a focus stack and to do it. It is very, very hard to perfect it. So even more so than just macro, but getting into focus stacking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fine tuning and getting it exactly right is the challenge. But I would encourage everyone. The first time I put it off for a very long time. I was very intimidated. Oh, it's going to be a lot. I don't have the time to spend to look, and just doing it once, running through the process to see how it works and how you do it. Yeah, it is a tool that opens up a lot of different areas for photography. Be it if you're shooting macro or focus stacking in a landscape world as well, opens up a lot of different possibilities, and you can do a lot of different things shooting landscapes, but focus stacking. So I encourage everybody. That's one thing that I wish I had played around earlier and just done it. I was intimidated for many years of like, yeah, hearing about what you're doing. I'm going to take 15, 20 images, sometimes more images at a different plane of focus, and then I've got to combine each of those, and I've got to look for the sharpest parts of each of them. No, software does a lot of that combining, and a lot like you can do it all in software. There are going to be imperfections, and cleaning up the imperfections is where the challenge comes in. But I encourage everybody to make an attempt at focus stacking. It's worth going through.
Oh yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with that. Landscapes, macro, all kinds of things.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, Stephen, this has been a great, very informative episode. I hope everyone can extract some information and use it in their own photography. Where's the best place to find out more about Laowa lenses?
So Laowa lenses, our website venuslens.net. Um, that's the main hub where we've got all of the different lenses you can look through and find. But then also from there you can find our different social medias, whatever you're on, Instagram, Facebook, a couple others there as well. So and that's where you can see some news. But also I'm gonna push another plug out, uh, certainly for hunts, but also check out your local camera store.
Hmm.
Yeah, if you haven't been into your local camera store in a while, or you're not sure where your closest local camera store is, I'm going to throw a plug in there. Take a look at your local camera store. Um, my job is to help them carry Laowa and carry the Laowa line. So um, I'm a firm believer in the value of uh, having a camera store in your community and nearby. So check them out and support them. So Hunts is a local camera store, um, and so certainly supporting Hunts is great. But also, if you've got a store in your community, check them out.
For sure,
Yeah,
yeah. Thanks for coming on
agreed.
tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate the time, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for watching the Owl Outdoors Photography Podcast. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and the video version on YouTube as well. You can subscribe down below, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.